Okay, I'm Chris Freeman, and I'm going to be your guide through modern world history. And I just wanted to start out by doing a little introduction to myself, bringing you to my home, so where I live, and to try and make a little more personal connection to you guys as we go through our learning experience this semester. Because online learning sometimes has a real disconnect. I mean, you can do really great learning because a lot of it is self-directed, but sometimes we need to have ways in which that like a voice is connecting the readings and the tests and the papers so that we can kind of bring things together in a more cohesive whole. So I'll be doing these weekly podcasts to try and hit on some of the highlights for the themes for the week. And the beginning of the class is really one of my favorites. And moving into the Silk Road and getting into the way in which that we rethink the potential for the way in which the world can operate is really pretty provocative and dynamic. It's really interesting to think that there was a world system in place that connected the world together very tightly and meaningfully, that was not based upon militarism and did not create walls, it didn't put children in cages. It didn't create a global military industrial complex just to trade goods, just to trade services and ideas. That's a completely modern invention. And sometimes when we rethink, okay, how did humanity connect itself together before, we had the age of technology? They really did it in meaningful ways. And they did it by extending a kind of cosmopolitan worldview, where there was no real racial difference that differentiated one group of people from another. I mean, sure, people had different ideologies and different faiths. They had different kind of ethnicities and cultural backgrounds. But there wasn't fundamental differences that disjointed human beings based on physiognomatic features, based on a science of race. These are all modern conceptions. The nation state didn't exist. In many ways, the things that we think of as being totally normal are absolutely not in human history. There was no nationalism that divided up people's kind of identities. People had continuities of social organization and kind of cultural outlooks. Of course, they had all that, but they didn't have these other mechanisms that really disrupted how people saw each other's collective humanity. And thinking about trade, especially pre-modern trade, is a great way to kind of reconnect ourselves with the potential for thinking about what global communities might look like as we go forward. I mean, this is a big deal. When we think about the amount of U.S. spending, I mean, just in the U.S., the U.S. spends about $750 billion a year on its military, maybe another $120 billion a year on its police force. And we think about these kind of mechanisms of control that largely govern the rules of private property and trade. That's what these two massive complexes were designed to do, was to make trade and protect property. We're a real aberration from the way in which the human beings have always done it. And I really find that thinking about the Silk Road is a great way to rehumanize ourselves and about what we really need and about how we want to think about how we engage in trade in the first place. Because trade should be pretty simple. You've got some things, someone has other things, and you make an exchange based upon reasonable understandings. You don't have to impose trade on people. If the stuff you're trading is worthwhile, that's not necessary. And that's what's interesting about the Silk Road, is that what they were trading was really worthwhile. So the first thing I want to introduce you guys to is that in the Silk Road, they traded goods that had intrinsic value. And the way we are using it in this class is to signify that these are goods that had a certain value that was intrinsic to the thing itself. It was unique, it had rareness, it had beauty. It had something that couldn't be labeled from the outside in. And I think this made trade work a lot better. Because when we think about the things that we trade today, most of the ways in which we think about value, this whole system of valuation is made from the outside in. We have to have, advertising. We have to have, videos. We have to have spokesmodels. We have to have all these people that speak for the goods that we trade. But in the Silk Road, they didn't have to have any of that because the goods spoke for themselves. And that's an incredibly valuable insight to get into the understanding of how this global system could have worked without global armies, without like walls, without nation states, without even a police force that we would recognize today. So the goods are important. And in terms of what the Silk Road did, it connected all these different groups that spanned, from Beijing and China all the way to Antioch, which is on the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean. It cut down into Africa and skirted the North African coast all the way to Morocco. Of course, that's where a first great hero in the class, for me anyway, Ibn Battuta was from. He was from Tangiers. That was on that far western coast of Africa. On that probably, maybe a few hour ferry ride from Spain. So very well connected into the Mediterranean world, very well connected to Europe going north, and very well connected to those African empires that spanned that North African littoral, that coastline. So the world that was connected, it was long and wide-ranging. It covered massive geographic areas, and it crossed languages, it crossed landscapes, across deserts, across mountains. And if you took the sea route, it would connect you from the Arabian Sea to the Indian Ocean to points east of the Pacific. If you were talking about the land route, you'd be talking about moving from Africa up through what would stay the Middle East, through Syria, over to Antioch, and then across the northern route. Or there was an Arabian southern route that came down and skirted the southern coast, going through Mesopotamia, and that's the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley civilizations. Like we call those like Iran and Iraq today. But in the deep history, these nation states that we've mapped out the world with, they're really a 20th century phenomenon. Europe may be earlier, but most of the kind of nation states that we are familiar with really only emerged in the 20th century, and they cause a lot of problems. So in this dynamic Silk Road, we're seeing places without walls, without boundaries, and we're seeing cooperative trading networks that really make the whole system work together. So the key to this, massive, far-flung trade route really is the middlemen that held these things together. And it's at these small trading emporia. People have to get food. They have to have water. They have to rest themselves. They have to, revitalize themselves. And these little small emporia all along the way, these oases, these small trading areas going through the deserts, and these larger scale cities that go back 8,000 years and more. It's an ancient kind of pathway into the way in which the world was connected. So the Silk Road is amazing, and I hope that you got into the kind of dynamic of it and kind of the beauty of it and the vitality of it. And it was driven not just by the goods they traded, but the journey was part of the value itself. And think how different from today. You don't know where the heck your goods came from. They were mass produced, they were put in a ship, and they were, crossing sea routes without any stories or personalities giving life to that movement, to that journey. And the Silk Route, that was, the value. That people were heading out to points that was sparking people's imaginations. Now trade is governed by places you really don't want to know about, in conditions that are unspeakable. And that transformation is what we're going to be kind of exploring in our class and trying to think more deeply about the nature of the modern world and how, mechanisms of control and production and technology have really left us distant from the world in lots of ways. So while in the modern perspective, we know lots about the world, we really don't have any feeling for the kind of understanding of ethnicities, for the way in which these alternate life ways and views on the world can add meaning to our lives. And that's what Ibn Battuta's travels were all about, wherever he went to discover the stories of the places he found himself in. I mean, he would do the same thing for politics, to philosophy, to religion. He always sought out the religious leaders of other faiths because he knew in his heart that knowing more about all faiths helped him know more about his faith. And what a difference from the way in which we think about this commerce of kind of religiosity today and spirituality. There's a broken connection between these alternate religious visions of the world. And religious groups don't think the other religions have anything to teach them about their truth. I mean, you couldn't get more different than Ibn Battuta as a Muslim who seeks out Christian saints. Seeks out Christian saints in Egypt to understand their view of the divine so that it could increase his view of God's work in the world as a Muslim. So when we think about these kind of relationships, a lot of them were based upon dialogue, human interaction, and stories. And that connected people in a way that I think gave them more trust and more confidence that they could believe in the people with whom that they would be staying and partnering with, because everyone knew that every little piece in that Silk Road was important to make the whole thing work. It was a global partnership. And thinking about that kind of reality, I mean, when we're facing the types of global problems that we're facing today, with global warming, global poverty, environmental degradation, we're going to need more than a military to fix those problems. We're going to need something of this idea of how the global community operated. In order to do that, we're going to need to know some history, because the way things operate today is not the way things operate in the past, never have been. In fact, we're more different from the story of humanity than we could ever imagine. What we take for granted and what we think of as normal would have been thought of as completely irrational and inhuman in the pre-modern world. So we'll be diving into lots of these questions because thinking historically is really important and instructive for us as we think about what human beings can do. And you only know our potential as human beings by thinking about what we've done. And some of the amazing things that people have done, like Ibn Battuta traveling 75,000 miles on donkey, on Arabic dhows, plying the seas. He was shipwrecked. He was marooned. He was a advisor to mad sultans. He was imprisoned. It's a miraculous story, but to us. But in the Silk Road, his life was indicative of what people perhaps aspired to do, at least in terms of how we think about merchants and trade. They had to do it themselves. Nowadays, we've got a system that's set up that largely allows bankers and multinational corporations to enjoy U.S. military spending that really functions like a welfare system that allows them to ply their craft and trade. There was no military that looked out for, the merchants of the Silk Road. It was up to the communities to take care of the people and the travelers and to welcome people from other parts of the globe into their communities because they knew their community depended on it. I mean, how different now, right? So I think we can learn a lot from these things. And I think that the story starting out in this world is really important. And the Silk Road itself, really, when we think about it historically, we think about it starting sometime in the 2nd century BC, maybe 148 BC. But really, these old world travel networks, they had been in operation, but they hadn't been as seamlessly connected as they were in the 2nd century. And of course, the culture group that did that were the Chinese. It was the Han Dynasty that did that. And then the Han Dynasty is going to smooth this eastern route. But before then, the Persian Empire, and that's where modern day Iran is. The Persian Empire is going to create that middle road. And then there's a North African littoral, that coastline, that is made up of a number of African communities and, entities that connect this far-flung trading network together. And it's important to understand that everyone played their role in those regions. Not one person had to dominate the Silk Road. That's impossible. What you had was trading partnerships in a global system that made the whole thing work. And it never worked better than when the Arabs were running it in the golden age of Arabic trade, maybe the 13th century, and that's Ibn Battuta. That's when he's operative in the world, 13th and 14th centuries. And it is a world where the Arab world knit this whole kind of patchwork quilt together. And interestingly enough for us, they did it with a kind of ethos or an ethical understanding of how trade operated, a philosophy of trade that is founded in Islam and founded in Sharia law and ways in which that it gave ethical codes of behavior for how merchants operated. I mean, Muhammad was a merchant, he was a trader. And that ethical outlook on how we trade amongst each other, that was a vital part of that story of Islam. And that's what was driving that explosion of Islam. In the contemporary perspective, we like to think of it as being one that was made by conquest, but really it was one that was made by trade. And when we think about the ways in which that it realized itself in the golden age of Arabic trade, it was a beautiful time of efflorescence, trading stories, philosophies. We're finding new inventions like the dhow, this graceful ship that speeds merchants along their way. This is vital to understand how this system operated, and that's on the eve of the rise of Europe. Up until this point, you're not going to find too many white people on the Silk Road. And in fact, you're not going to find too many Europeans operating in this trading network in any way that has any type of value. Because quite simply, Europe was resource poor. Europeans didn't have anything that the rest of the world wanted. The rest of the world had silks. They had inventions like gunpowder, paper. The rest of the world had spices. Europe didn't have that. Europe had wool. They had slaves. And they had swords. They traded elegant weaponry. But when it comes to what people wanted, Europe just didn't have it. And so when Europe broke into that world, they did it with militarism because they didn't have anything of equal value to trade. So that militarization of trade and the advent of Europeans in that world as a breaking apart of the global system is going to be a kind of idea that we're going to be exploring a little bit. But that is to say that I think where we're at now is really one of my favorite times in history. So spend some time ruminating about like what that would have been like to walk, that 4,000 plus miles on camel, maybe some donkeys in the Silk Road. I mean, think about that. Daily journeys, 10 to 50 miles. That was when, trade was made by that embodiment in the world. And think about how connected people were to the rhythms, the folkways, the pathways, and to the geography. And this is without maps. This is without Google Maps. This is without, the ways in which we map ourselves out. Like, I don't know if I would even make it to most of my destinations if I didn't have, my cell phone. In this world, you had to really depend on your smarts and trust in other people. And this vibrant, path of the Silk Road really comes alive, I think, in that movie that we watched by Tim McIntosh Smith. And he really shows us that a lot of that world is still alive. And they're trading things that still have got value that maybe operate a little differently than in the American market mentality. And I think that can be instructive. All right. Well, I don't want to go on too long. It's getting too boring. Anyway, welcome to the class. I hope your first week, you're getting your feet wet, you're getting grounded, everything's going all right in the midst of education and COVID. But we'll make it through. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We have a quiz on Monday. That's tomorrow. I think it's important that we learn something about what's happening in the Silk Road, and it's going to be important for your midterms too. All the things in this class, they operate like a scaffolding. You do your initial research on them, like for this quiz, and those ideas are going to be very important later in your midterms when you write your essays. Same thing with your discussion posts. Please pay attention to those and always use evidence. In history, it's all about the evidence. You don't have any evidence, you don't have any history. But remember this. Here's a big hint for the class. If you use evidence, that means quotation, and put them into your discussion posts, you will then be able to use those quotations, that evidence, later when you write your essays. Because when you write your history essays, you have to have your evidence. And if you find your evidence now, and you use it when you're doing your preparations for your discussion boards, but also in prep for your quizzes, that information is going to be the basis from which you write your essays. So it's designed that you build the essays as you move along in the course, and you develop a kind of mindset that you can answer some of the bigger questions as we go along. And you want to be in a good position to do that so you're not stressing out when it's trying to write your essays for your midterms. If you stay up with the reading and you are collecting your evidence as you go along, this class is not going to be very challenging for you. In history, it's all about collecting your material and then putting it together in a way that makes an argument that's clear and cogent and that uses facts to back it up. It's sort of the opposite of politics in America today. You want an argument that's rational, you want to have facts, and you want to have it all make sense together. But these things, they're not hard, they just take a little bit of time. And so if you do the class in the way that we've laid it out for you, you're going to be in a good position to go when we finally do those essays for the more important parts of the class, at least as far as your grades are concerned. Okay, that's it. Good luck. We'll see you next week. I hope you're enjoying the material, or at least getting something kind of thought-provoking out of it. And it's fun to kick these ideas around about like, wow, what kind of world was that? How amazing were those people? And what kind of outlook must they have had on the world to have enabled them to do the things that they did, given the circumstances they lived in? All right, I'll see you next time.